It's lovely to be able to talk about Paris, and this series, which I'm calling the Villages of Paris, is going to be about three iconic regions: Saint-Germain-des-Prés, the Nouvelle Athènes, and the Marais, which don't, as I said in the brochure, don't exactly correspond to arrondissement. And this is really what I'm going to be exploring today. Now, of course, all of these areas of Paris have so much in common, and yet these ones have a very distinctive flavour about them. The French are very interested in this idea of lieu de mémoire, places of history, places that speak of ideas of the homeland, of la patrie. And each of these particular areas have enormous importance in French history. The one we're going to be looking at today is going to be Saint-Germain-des-Prés, and I'm going to be looking at it from the point of view of it being the cradle of the French Revolution. And one of the things that I think I'll be emphasising, and you'll see that actually in the subsequent lectures, is that the geography of a place in many ways influences the outcome of events. Well, this is my conclusion. When you actually see where the main protagonists of the French Revolution lived, they lived literally a block from each other. You can sort of see how these things come together. And it's very much the same thing with the Impressionist group, who ended up all living in the same street and, of course, intermingled and, of course, begin to form connections. So I just want to quickly run through a few sort of series of pictures, because Saint-Germain-des-Prés, it's the place that we all go to, I suppose, when people mention Paris. You've got the Café de Flore, you've got these tiny little lanes. It's part of this area which actually hasn't been cut off by the Haussmannisation in the 1860s. We come out of the metro and immediately you're confronted with Danton, the great mover and shaker of the revolution. This is the area of the first great department store, but also it's all these little tiny boutiques, florists, this new idea of baking. This is poilane. Those of you who went with me on the eating tour of Paris, I can't remember, it did have a classier name. Because up until something like about 10 years ago, the French baguette was in dire straits. It was being sort of made and then frozen and sent out to different patisseries. And so poilane actually continues to cook this special poilane bread, which you now ask for when you actually go into a bakery. And this is, of course, in Saint-Germain-des-Prés, as is Hermé, with, of course, these extraordinary patisserie shops that you know of. So I want then to look at this rather confusing map of Paris, and it is going to get better from here in, I'll tell you. For that. All right, so we actually have what are known as arrondissements, which start here and go round in a spiral. And I'm going to look at the evolution of the structure of Paris before I actually start looking at Saint-Germain-des-Prés in specific terms. And the area that we're looking at is theoretically in the 6th, and it's a quarter of the 6th arrondissement, which is why it's called a quartier, right, un quart in French. However, when people speak about Saint-Germain-des-Prés, they don't actually mean just that particular geographical area, which is just around the church. They sort of mean part of the 7th, and also right down to the Jardin de Luxembourg down here. So I want to explain now, actually, I'm going to talk about the structure of Paris and explain why you get slightly confusing and contradictory ways of referring to the geography of Paris. The first thing I want to look at is the very basic structure, which starts in early medieval times. In fact, it starts basically when the Romans leave. The Romans, of course, had sort of settled on the Ile de la Cité because, of course, it was safe. They put chains across the water, and it was strategically safe. By the Middle Ages, the early to Middle Ages, you, however, have the city dividing into three parts that I'll look at in a moment. You have the church, which is of course centred on Notre Dame, a very powerful church, which will, as we'll see in a moment, send out its teachers into the left bank, which will become the university. And of course, it still is. And on the other side, you have the town, right, which will expand further and further. And what is of interest is, with Paris, is that nothing really has changed. You might actually, people who actually come up into the 9th arrondissement, they sort of look around, it's nighttime, there's nothing happening, and this is because it is still the headquarters of the newspapers, of the banks. It's still basically people who work in finance, as opposed to intellectuals, or so-called intellectuals, who are on the left bank. Up until very recently, all the bookshops, all of the publishing companies were over here, and the church was here, in fact, there and everywhere. So this then was the Ile de la Cité. What we see there, in fact, what you see basically in Paris now is the Paris of 1860, which was restructured under Napoleon III. The island of the Ile de la Cité originally had something like 20 or 30 little churches or chapels, and these of course were gradually eradicated as Haussmann put through new bridges and pulled most of this part down. So it still now remains as, I suppose, the centre, the heart of Paris, Notre Dame. This is where, whenever a president now is elected, a Te Deum is actually set up in Notre Dame. It's not very different from the times of the monarchy. I'd just like you to look at this. This is Ile Saint-Louis, which we'll talk about in a moment. So this then is what was, the heart of the church. Now, in the 12th century, I'm sorry about this slide because it's the only one I could get of Abelard. Pierre Abelard, who is probably known best for his affair with Héloïse d'Argenteuil, it's sort of the Twitter of the day, I suppose. It's not trivial, but I mean, people know of him because of this. In actual fact, he was a great teacher. He was the first person to start using Aristotelian logic and the way of discussing things and relating that to church dogma. And for this, he was considered a rather thorny person. He was, and one of the reasons he gets into so much trouble is more because of the way in which he is going against some of the church doctrine than for his marriage with Héloïse, although he pays dearly for it. So he actually begins the trend of going over to the left bank and teaching, and universities in those days, of course, didn't have anywhere where you could actually go, and so the teacher would stand. This is at Mont Saint-Geneviève. It's not a mountain. The Mont Saint-Geneviève is around the Pantheon area now. He would stand out in a street or in a balcony, and the students would sit on straw and listen to his words, and actually some of them would actually have text which they would annotate as well. So this is the tradition, of course, of the Latin Quarter. People come from all over the world to actually listen to the great teaching, not of Abelard, but of other people, questioning church doctrine, commenting on the text, looking at the ancient text. And all around that left bank, you're going to get these different colleges. And this was the Irish College, which still exists today. This is the Collège des Irlandais, and you can actually get in there for concerts. Finally, Robert Sorbonne, in the beginning of the 13th century, gives money to set up a permanent structure for the university, and this is why you get the Sorbonne as it is now. So that then is the church, the left bank, taken over to intellectual affairs, and that's where the universities are basically centred now. There's about 7 universities now in Paris, but the 2 main ones are there. So on the right bank, the city had worked around guilds, and the most important of these guilds was the guild relating to the boatmen. And they, being the most important, they were the ones who were set up in the town hall. So this area here was called La Grève, right? Because grève are small stones. And when people actually wanted to come and find work, they used to come to the grève, whereas now, of course, faire la grève is the actual opposite. You know, you actually go on strike. It's a really quite an interesting way in which the French have managed to turn that one around. All right, so because the marchands were the most important, the shipbuilders and the people who brought the food up and down the river were the most powerful, it is they who actually have their motif on the coat of arms of Paris. So you've got the red, white, and blue. The red and the red and the blue were the colours of Paris. This is of Saint Martin. White was, of course, the colour of the monarchy, and it's how you get the tricolore. But the boat refers to these boatmen, and the coat of, at least the motto, fluctuat nec mergitur, it will always stay afloat. It might float, but it will never be submerged. With, of course, the insignia of the Bourbon, the crenellated crown, because it's a walled city, and I'll be talking about that for a moment. And they've given themselves the laurel wreath of triumph, because, of course, they triumphed in so many wars, as we know, and gave themselves also the Legion of Honour and the highest level of the Cross of the War. I mean, which is quite keeping a perfectly straight face. We are moving along now. You've now got then this basic structure of Paris, which in many ways echoes the way it is laid out still. Now, the other interesting thing that we need to look at here too is the fact that Paris is a walled city, or was a walled city, and the remnants of these walls and even present-day Paris echoes completely this walled structure. And by this I mean the roads that go around Paris and the metro lines that go under Paris echo this as well. So we start out with this wall here, the wall of Philippe Auguste, which is built in, 1180. This was to protect Paris. Now already they had to the west, you had the Louvre, which originally, of course, was just a fortress. It wasn't where the kings lived. And it certainly wasn't an art gallery. That's going to come in the 18th century. All right, so it is protected here. Now, this is a massive construction. It was sort of something like, I think it was 10 metres high and 3 metres thick, and had 10 gates. And when they actually excavated the Louvre, when they were actually putting up Prés pyramid, they actually found underground these massive bastions which exist. And if you go to the Louvre, you can actually see them. Now, so this is the wall of Philippe Auguste, and it is gradually, all these walls will be pulled down by subsequent kings. So we then get towards 1320, Charles V, is it? He actually expands out of the right bank. So you notice that it's the right bank that develops, not the left bank, all right? Because this is where the commerces and all of these people are. This is also where the orchards are. So this wall is pulled down, even though I can show you one of the pieces of it. And I have a very early map showing you the development of Paris. Now this is exactly what happened. It's around the wrong way, isn't it? Yeah, it's around. But that's the way I'm going to draw it. This is the left bank, and this is the right bank. You can see the trace of the original wall, which has been pulled down and is gradually expanded further. Now, at this time, when you actually look at nowadays, if we look at the city, we see basically two main islands. You see the Ile de la Cité, which is here. It's got two little bits down there. It doesn't now, but it did. And we also see one island, which is the Ile Saint-Louis. Now, these islands were actually joined. Charles, at least Henry IV, is going to build the Pont Neuf across here and is going to join these little pieces to the Ile de la Cité. Right? This is the island of the Jews, where the Jews were burnt, and then it becomes a prisoner island. So that's joined to the Ile de la Cité. Back here, in this text, until about the 17th century, these were three little islands, until an entrepreneur called Marie gets the approval to pull them together and to build beautiful mansions. And so these are joined together, and this one here is joined into the bank of the Seine. So that disappears, this becomes one, and it is renamed the Ile Saint-Louis. So when if you actually look back at the here you see how it is an island which has been completely constructed with one main street down the middle, right, and it's built at one time, basically, right? It hasn't developed higgledy-piggledy over the years. Now, Louis XIV, his father, of course, continues to build out even further, pulling this down, but Louis XIV, when he comes to power, goes into a number of wars and is victorious, particularly in the Netherlands and against the Germans, and has this idea that, of course, his realm, France now, is so secure that Paris, its capital, doesn't need walls. So this was a very, very powerful message to send to anyone. I mean, up until then, all cities were walled. It was too dangerous not to be. So the fact that he could pull down the walls meant that his power was endless. And so he does, and the city of Paris had actually, every time he came back from a great victory, would give him a gate. And a lot of you who've been to Paris with me know these gates. This is the Porte Saint-Martin and the Porte Saint-Denis, which are just near each other, and which were originally part of the walls, the gates of the walls. So the walls are pulled down, and you've got these two triumphal arches up on these upper boulevards, which a lot of people don't really sort of know about. So the city of Paris then remains an open city, basically up until, I think this is 17, I can't even read this, 34 or whatever it is, or 80, what is it, 17? Or 17, whatever. And this is no longer a wall which is to fortify the city. It's a tax wall, and it's called the Wall of the Fermiers Généraux, and they're not general farmers, they are taxmen. All right, and this was because all food and drink which was brought into Paris across these walls had to be taxed, right? And this, of course, is why Montmartre and all of these other little outlying villages which would have been out there became so popular, because people could go out to the cabaret out there and drink at a much lower rate, eat at a much lower rate than you could if you had to bring the food and stuff across this bridge. And it had to be, there had to be 100 metres on the inside. This is because people were starting to dig tunnels underneath. The sort of Palestinians, had nothing on these Parisians. Now this, of course, being the French, they made it extremely elegant. There were something like 80 tax houses, and they weren't little booths. They were designed by the great sort of architect of the time, Ledoux, in a sort of the beginning of a neoclassical style. And there are a couple of these left. This one is in the Parc Monceau. A lot of you will know it. And people actually lived above. So this wall was the wall, basically, which is going to exist up until the time of Napoleon III. All right, those of you who have read Zola, and I know there are a lot of you here who have, that the Assommoir begins with the passage where Gervaise looks at the wall being pulled down. So Napoleon III is going to actually pull all of this wall down and incorporate the areas outside. Now, I now want to look at the arrondissement and the quartier. Now, up until the end of the Middle Ages, all right, so we've got these walls that we've spoken about, we've got these divisions also, but this now is an administrative overlay of all of that. Are you with me? All right, so the basic overlay of this was that all of Paris was divided up into fiefs, if you call it that, which belonged to the great abbeys. So if you look at Paris, the way in which it was divided, you just look at the names of saints: Saint-Antoine, Saint-Gervais, Saint-Germain, Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois, Saint-Opportune, Saint-Honoré, and so on. Now, they were sort of basically parishes, but each of these related to an abbey, land which had been either given by the King of France to the different abbeys, and they were extremely powerful. They had a bishop, and they often didn't even answer to the king. And when we're going to be talking about Saint-Germain, you will see that they had their own prisons, they had their own law systems, their own police. They were sort of almost like little cities unto themselves. Now, this changes. I just wanted to show you, for example, how important these little, these areas were. For example, with Saint-Jacques, in the centre of Paris, you would know Saint-Jacques-la-Boucherie, that lovely tower which remains, Saint-Jacques of the Butchers, but Saint-Jacques, had its own parish church in the centre. Now, towards the end of the 18th century, up the 18th century, it has become too unruly. The kings are actually now trying to exert more power, and so it is divided up now into something like about 20 areas and 20 suburbs, right? So what you have here then is, instead of, you'd have Saint-Denis, and then if you had the wall system, remember we talked about the walls? Once you crossed over a wall, it became a suburb. Suburbs, below being part of the city in Latin. And a faubourg is a false part of the city, all right? So in other words, if you look at all of these, you get Saint-Germain, and then you get Faubourg Saint-Germain, Saint-Martin, Faubourg Saint-Martin. And even when you go around Paris today, the same street, at a certain point, as it crosses over what was the wall, becomes a faubourg. Right? Now, these means that they weren't entirely integrated into the system. Now, this was an attempt to really put some kind of structure and to control Paris, which was already becoming unruly. So, by the time of the French Revolution, things have completely changed. All right, you now have the third estate, in other words, the everyday workers, who now want to vote, and so Paris is divided into 48 little parts. And this was not just an electoral part, but it was the idea that people now could, come together as groups and discuss their destiny, and this idea of control, so it had to be made into smaller groups. At the time, of course, they get rid of all these pesky names like Saint-Germain. You've got this one called West, and up here Saint-Opportune becomes Brutus, and some rather amazing names, Concorde and so on. But all of these names, you couldn't have a name of a king or a name of a saint anywhere in Paris. It was a complete eradication. That's something that's almost impossible to imagine nowadays. Now, this was then modified by the time you get to my friend Napoleon. And you now have what existed up until 1860, which was 12 what are now called arrondissements, each of which are divided into fours. And so now you have an official quartier, an official quarter. All right? But as we'll see, the name doesn't exactly exist. Now, so Napoleon, of course, being this great administrator, wants to have things centralised, and so the arrondissement system exists. All right, each one has a town hall, each one has a hospital, each one has a school. People don't think of Napoleon as in this way, but he's the one that will structure all of these sort of small cities, which really do become villages. By 1860, his nephew comes to power, and as you know, he decides to completely reconstruct Paris, put through the boulevards, pull down the walls, so you've got an inner boulevard system and an outer boulevard system, and he annexes all of these parts outside Paris, which were originally towns. So you have Montmartre, which becomes the 18th arrondissement, you have Belleville, all these people who were, kicking and struggling were pulled in to Greater Paris, and so you now have a wall which is built by Thiers in 1814, which is round the limits of Paris. This was the last wall that was supposed to stop the Germans from coming in, which was a complete waste of time. But it was something that forms Paris because it actually had to have 200 metres this side of it. And this became known as the zone. This was all the criminal activities took place there. In fact, it's evoked in many of the songs of Edith Piaf, for example. So you now get the 20 arrondissements that exist today. But you would note that they are differently numbered, and this was because no one wanted to be number 13. And the people who lived round here, round the Jardin de Luxembourg, were a snotty lot, and definitely didn't want to live in the 13th, so the entire number system was rearranged to fit them in. So you get the people, the working class down here, who end up with number 15 and number 13. So that then is the structure. Now there's just one last thing I want to talk about with the structure of Paris, is that you basically have this axis of east and west, which still exists from the point of view of the way people vote, and in many ways a sort of class system as well. The wealthy, the educated, the people who vote theoretically to the right, although it's become unclear now, basically live in the west of Paris. And the working class, the revolutionary side of Paris, and in fact all the sort of boho chic sort of people tend to be in the east and in the northeast. Now, what are the basic tenets of the right wing? You know, grosso modo, it's church, army, and monarchy. All right? And so in the west, the monuments that dominate the west of Paris are, of course, the Arc de Triomphe, built by Napoleon to commemorate his great victories, and the great army. You know that France's glory is on the basis of its military conquests. The heart of France is, of course, Notre Dame. I can't believe it hasn't been bombed, but it's still surviving. And, of course, the heart by now of Paris was the Louvre, as the kings had moved in there. Now, what is very interesting, that when a king, for example, at the Restoration in 1814, when the Bourbons come back into power, and it's the same thing with the presidents of the Republic, if they're from the right wing, they come in to Paris. They don't just suddenly spring up in the middle of Paris. There's a whole sort of route that they follow according to their beliefs. So when you actually had people like de Gaulle, right, who was the president, or those kings, the Bourbon kings, they would come in from the west. They would go through the Arc de Triomphe, they would go to the Louvre, and they would end up in the heart of Paris and sing a Te Deum. All right? They claim Paris by this route. Now, the east of Paris is exactly the opposite, and you have one king who tries to sort of be a king of the people, but also, for example, take Mitterrand, very canny, and Hollande, less canny. When they were coming in to take power, they come in from the east. All right, and it's a significant statement, a very significant statement. And they come in through the, round the Place de la Bastille, which speaks of revolution, and it actually speaks of two revolutions, the revolution and the revolution of 1830, where you have people actually, bodies are actually buried under there. Then, of course, there's the revolution of 1848, Place de la République, and of course the revolution of the civil war of the Commune of 1871, when the French fight each other in Paris. The last communards are chased by their own army into Père Lachaise cemetery and are killed against the wall. So this has become one of these lieux de mémoire, these sacred sites, the Mur des Communards, the Mur des Fédérés it's called, and so these presidents would come and pay homage at each of these shrines. Right? So it's the geography is very significant. It's not just something which happens to be there. It's integrated very much into the system. Well, now you will sort of say, is she ever going to get on to Saint-Germain-des-Prés? So we're actually looking at the area of Saint-Germain-des-Prés is actually 1/4 of the 6th arrondissement. All right? Now, theoretically, it's just that. However, when you speak about it, you actually speak about all of this area. People will still say they lived in the Quartier Saint-Germain if they lived down near here, all right? Or if they lived in the 7th, and I'll see for the moment why. It's because Saint-Germain-des-Prés is built around Saint-Germain in the fields, all right, like St. Martin in the fields, because, of course, they were outside all of the walls. Even right up until the time of the Revolution, basically, they were outside the walls. And it had been founded, the Abbey of Saint-Germain was founded very, very early in 1558 by the Merovingians. Now, these are the original sort of dynasties, and the kings always want to sort of hark back to their connections with the Merovingians, the original sort of Frenchmen. Childebert is significant because his father, Clovis, had been converted by his wife, Clotilde, they obviously liked C's, to Roman Catholicism. The Franks actually were Christians, but they were Arians, all right? They didn't believe in the Trinity, and they didn't believe in the doctrine of the Roman Catholic Church. So it's a very significant step that these were the first kings who were converted to Roman Catholicism, and so they set up a church over a Roman temple, as often happens. So this is Childebert, and you actually have references to him in the stained glass windows. Now, Saint-Germain, as I said, was a city unto itself. And as I said before, justice, apart from having hospitals, market gardens and all of this sort of thing, they also had their own police and their own justice system. And in fact, up until the end of the Middle Ages, the kind of punishment that was meted out to you changed according to whether you had done the deed in Saint-Germain or at Saint-Martin or somewhere else. All right. So if they had their own system of judges and their own system of punishments, which was, of course, the pillory or death by horrible means. Anyway, this is Saint-Germain in the 17th century, and you will see that by the time, it's even so famous that it comes up in the illustrated medieval manuscripts. Here you have this. By the 18th century, it is a massive town almost on its own. And it has a fair every year, the Foire de Saint-Germain, which was incredibly important for the transmission of ideas, not just goods but ideas. And it was almost like the internet of the time, I suppose. People came with ideas from the other parts of Europe and they were exchanged in this fair, which had been going since medieval times. So it was this area full of ideas and power and wealth. It's impossible to realise how powerful these abbeys were. By the time we get to the end of the 18th century, a lot of people had started building around the edges of the abbey. So you get very powerful families building here. This was the cemetery. This was the entrance into the abbey here. And I just want to show you that there are parts of this which still remain today. So if you go to Place Fustembourg, which is just behind, that was remain of the abbey. This is the church, and this is now where you have a little square next to the church was the original cemetery, right? Now, of course, at the time of the Revolution, Saint-Germain-des-Prés doesn't fare very well. In fact, Childebert is dug up and decapitated again. This is what the revolutionary mobs did, and we'll be talking about that in a moment. They dug up all of the kings of France at Saint-Denis, decapitated them and threw the bones around. So this was the original. It was very, very important because this was the burial place of the first dynasty of French kings. So it was really a very important lieu de mémoire. Anyway, the church as it exists now, and I won't unfortunately have time to go into it, actually bears witness to these stages of development. So in the triforium, this is this area up here, these little columns have been taken from the original, I think it is 10th century church, which was on these grounds. And then the choir, or the ambulatory here, the columns that you have here, came from the Romanesque construction, right? And as it was built, as these churches were built over a number of centuries, by the time you got down towards the nave, it was a Gothic construction. So here you have the Gothic nave, and you would go down to the Romanesque choir, and in it you will see the Merovingian column. So it's really very much a panorama of very early Paris. Now in the 19th century, again, of course, you know there is the rediscovery of the Gothic under Viollet-le-Duc, and all of these churches are remodelled, not massively, but all of this painting comes from Viollet-le-Duc's study of what medieval churches would have looked like. There are significant changes to Saint-Germain, but they've actually stopped now. Now, I want to now look then at Saint-Germain-des-Prés and the revolution of 1789. So we're jumping a long way. So this was the area that we've been talking about. Boulevard Saint-Germain, of course, is cut right through in the 1860s by Haussmann and by Napoleon III. Now, this idea, one of the original walls, which would have been pulled down, and all of it truncates a whole area of what would have been the original abbey, and the rest of the abbey, which hadn't survived very well from the revolution, is around here. So this Boulevard Saint-Germain goes through in 1860 and eradicates all of this very dense urban area around here. This would have been nothing but tiny little streets, really only one or two of which remains to bear witness as what it was like. All of this was pulled down completely. Now, what I want to emphasise here is where the Odeon metro station is, and where you have the statue of Danton, was where Danton lived in a sort of 7-room house. Not just the fact that, even though you think of the revolutionaries as being sans culotte and in rags, he was quite a wealthy barrister, an extraordinary man. And just down here, like probably about 10 houses down, was where Marat lived. All right? So it's not a coincidence that you actually get these two people constantly talking to each other and forming the same revolutionary club. And they were influenced in the way in which they went about things by a butcher who lived there, who was always screaming, blue murder, holding up sides of beef and slashing them and slashing their throats. This is what we've got to do. And so, in many ways, he influences also the tenor of the way in which this particular club of the Cordeliers is going to form. All right, so with that in mind, you come up, and of course they have erected now a statue to honour this extraordinary man. He was a colossus. He was about 6'2". That was enormous for those days. Had a sort of booming voice and as ugly as sin. He had sort of, smallpox marks all over his face. But he had a voice, evidently, that could basically wake the dead. Now, he, on the bottom of the statue, he has two of the most famous words that he said. One of them, to eradicate the enemies of the Republic, il faut de l'audace et encore de l'audace, courage and more courage. And on the other side, it says, to succeed in the revolution, the people need not just bread, but education. So these are these two things that he had said. Now, he was all for taking the revolution throughout Europe, but of course, comes up against Marat. Now, Marat, living a couple of houses away, basically, they met and they will talk in this little street that I'm going to show you in a minute. Now, Marat, of course, is going to be murdered by Charles Corday, who belongs to a subgroup of the Cordeliers faction of the revolution, the Girondins, who were not as radical, who wanted constitutional monarchy, and saw Marat, who, by the way, was a thoroughly nasty person, as being much too radical. And so she takes it upon herself, of course, as you know the story, to come and stab him when he's in his bath, and she doesn't try and escape. She is taken out very proudly to the guillotine the same day. Now, Marat was, of course, in his bath, and the reason why he was there, he was actually a doctor, and again I think this is quite interesting to realise that these weren't these ragged people. One's a great famous barrister, another one's a doctor who lead the revolutionary movement, and of course he had a dreadful skin disease because he'd been chased by the police, the royal police, and had taken up hiding in sewers, one of the sewers, and so he developed this fungus sort of thing. He was someone who was constantly signing death warrants. This is the beginning of this, what we've taken over by Robespierre as the Reign of Terror. However, when he is killed, Jacques-Louis David does this wonderful painting of him, which we saw when we were in Brussels, of all places, of him as a martyr, all right, the first martyr of the revolution. So it's taken very much the structure from Caravaggio's Deposition of Christ. If you actually look at the sort of the way in which the hand and the arm draped. So there is no doubt as to whether this man gave up his life, for the causes of the revolution. He also, David, has this very sort of simple thing that looks like a tombstone with Marat's name on it, and you have the emphasis on the wound, the knife, and the fact that the poor fellow was actually writing out letters to poor people saying, yes, you can have hundreds of dollars, which of course actually was not true. And there he is reading the letter that Charlotte Corday was, on the pretext of which she got in. First of all, his mistress said she couldn't get in, that she kept coming back and knocking on the door. The mistress must have gone somewhere else and got in and finished him off. So here, the painting is nothing in the background to distract your view of the slumped head of the martyr, holding his pen, writing for freedom right to the end. Now, of course, being the first martyr, there's an apotheotic type of funeral, which again is masterminded by David. In fact, David was so good at these. He did enormous shows for Robespierre. He's the one that masterminds also the coronation of Napoleon, and Hitler, when he's having the Nuremberg rallies, actually studies and looks very much to the way in which David had worked. So here he is, sort of the first apotheosis. He's buried in the Pantheon, but as soon as the revolution's over, the body is taken out. We don't know where it is. All right, so what are we looking at now? All right, we're now looking at this tiny little street which goes off here, which is the Cour du Commerce Saint-André. Now, can you see how close all of these things are? All right, you've got Danton living here. You've actually got Marat living here. And where they used to meet is down here in the convent. The convent doesn't mean monastery of the Franciscans, which was down here. And the other great revolutionary was Desmoulins, who also lived here. And Robespierre is going to live over here. Right. So all of these people meet in this little street, all right, little lane, which hasn't been touched, all right? And so if you stand here, as many of you have with me, and look out there, you can actually see where Danton lived. And so Marat actually had his printing press about here, in one of these buildings here, which also contains this bastion of the original wall of Paris, the wall of Philippe Auguste. So in other words, where they lived was actually originally outside the first walls of Paris. So you can see this, and this is where he distributed the Cri du Peuple, right, and the first tracts that went out calling for the downfall, and the march on the Bastille comes from here. And they used to meet in the Procope. Still exists there. It's turned into a tourist hub, but it's very interesting. It's one of the first restaurants in Paris, and it already had hosted other revolutionary thinkers, and these were the people who wrote the encyclopedia. This is Diderot, D'Alembert, Voltaire used to come and argue here. In fact, they theoretically had the table that Voltaire is supposed to have thumped and broken. It's a marble table. Anyway, so in other words, this little area was this hub of revolutionary ideas from one century to another, and this will continue with Saint-Germain-des-Prés right up until the 50s, where you get Sartre and de Beauvoir. All right, so we're still in this little area. I spoke of where they used to meet, all right, which was down at the Faculty of Medicine, and this is the club of the Cordeliers. They were called Cordeliers because Franciscans wore a cord around their waist, all right, and theoretically, you could get into this. In fact, you could until last year, but they've now got a socialist mayor of Paris, and she's decided to make over a lot of places to student housing. And this, now you can't get in here, and it's been divided up into small student houses. And we'll see that next week too on another building, which has been turned into a youth hostel. Anyway, this is trying to integrate the types of things in the city. So this was where they used to meet. It's Robespierre who used to meet in the Rue Saint-Jacques. I won't have time to talk about that. So going back into this little alleyway, this little Cour du Commerce Saint-André, we come to Dr. Guillotin. All right. Now, Dr. Guillotin was a pacifist, really. He didn't believe in the death penalty. He thought it was barbaric. And he came up with the idea that if we have to eliminate these enemies of the state, of the homeland, we should make it as painless as possible. Because up until then, everyone who was a criminal was either hung, drawn, or quartered, or tortured, or unless you were a nobleman, and then you were beheaded. So he said, why can't everyone be beheaded if it has to be like that? We are in an equal society. And he came up with this wonderful phrase, all you will feel will be a courant d'air, a kind of breeze across your neck. And of course this was great hilarity broke out with this. Anyhow, he didn't invent it. The idea then was given credence, and a man called Monsieur Louis was the engineer who designed it, and then it was given over to a German, Schmidt, who actually made the first reduced version of the guillotine here in this tiny little street opposite where Marat had his printing press, and tried it on sheep, and that was successful. So then they tried it on criminals, not actually here, they would have gone somewhere else, and it is then becomes the Louise. That was the name of it, because it had been invented by the engineer Louis. However, with all of these, as you know, with sort of campaign slogans like "Let's Make America Great Again," they were all singing these songs, and they needed something that rhymed with machine. You know the machine. So guillotin becomes guillotine. Dr. Guillotine is upset about this, and in fact will be imprisoned and almost guillotined himself, because he is known to be harbouring the relatives of some of the émigrés who are the royalists who are leaving Paris. He escapes, and after the revolution tries to set up his practice again, but no one really wants to go to Dr. Guillotine. Anyway, it's an interesting story, but that's what it is. And next there you've got this wonderful little Cour de Rouen, which is just off this area, which is a sort of 16th century part. So you can see this is what Paris looked like before Haussmann put his boulevards through. By the way, most of this is owned by either people from Saudi Arabia, Qatar, or America. And so if you go and look at the names of the things, they've got ridiculous names like Toulouse-Lautrec or something. It's not there. Now, just continuing along very, very briefly, going through the Rue de Bussy, which is just you come out of that little street onto the Rue de Bussy. This is where the first massacre of the revolution took place. This was prisoners and priests who had refused to become part of the revolution. They refused to take the oath of the revolution. They were being walked along here, and they were massacred in September. This is the beginning of the bloodbath, which will become the reign of terror under Robespierre. Now, also in this area, this little web of streets, one street further down, there was a woman called Mademoiselle Lenormand. And because they were living a time of such extraordinary upheaval, where the church had been discredited, at least had been banned in many ways. Robespierre was trying to sort of put up alternate ideas of, the feast of the Supreme Being. They were trying to sort of put some kind of spiritual apparatus in place. People turned very much to alternative things, and in particular to tarot cards and mesmer, with animal magnetism. And the people all of the people who would be players basically under Bonaparte, and in fact Bonaparte himself, and particularly his silly wife, Josephine, will come to have her fortune told by Mademoiselle Lenormand, as will Thérèse Tallien, who is married to Tallien, who will be the person who brings down Robespierre. All right, so this was this era of uncertainty, this idea of trying to be able to perceive what will happen in the future. So it really turns to superstition. She actually is credited with the first sort of the tarot pack that you still buy, if any of you are into tarot readings. I just wanted to show you what happens to Saint-Germain-des-Prés. in 1871. That's the Civil War. You sort of think of it as being, oh, it's just a civil war. It was, most of the parts of Paris were destroyed completely. And also, I just wanted to show you, in 1910, when the River Seine overflows, this is what it looked like in Saint-André-des-Arts, where I've just been showing you, where it was completely underwater, people going about with boats. Now, I want to go down to the south, directly south of Saint-Germain, to the second biggest church in Paris, which is Saint-Sulpice. It's a church which is, it's not an attractive church, but that's just my particular. It's almost like a St. Peter's take on Bernini with the towers. Well, it is, isn't it, with the different layers. It was built in the 17th and then completed in the 18th century. It, of course, was attacked at the time of the Revolution, and one of the things which is extremely interesting is that when you actually go into Saint-Sulpice, they actually didn't have time to eradicate all the sort of signs. So the cross, there's a little Cupid holding a cross, and so part of the cross has been, you know, pulled out so that it looks as though he's got a sword. You know what I mean? So they tried to sort of change things as much as they could, but they actually even, there were elements of royal insignia up here, and people managed to get right up into these towers and lowered themselves down on ladders and with hammers eradicated these symbols which were here and here. It's really quite extraordinary, the fanaticism and the lengths to which people would go to get rid of the hated ideas of royalty and the church. It's a massive church, and it's evidently, there are these secret passages upstairs, and people have got apartments, there are hanging gardens. It's really, there's a whole sort of, cult that works up there. This is what it looks like. The reason I'm talking about it is, first of all, it's the one that appears in Dan Murphy, to such an extent that the church has actually put something up, sort of saying it's got nothing to do with the Rose line, it's to do with the saints who are venerated there. But it does have this line, this gnomon, which of course goes across, which was used in the 18th century to calculate Easter. And the church, the Roman Catholic Church, was beginning to accept the ideas of Galileo and accept that these things could be calculated according to the movement of the stars and so on. And so this was used to calculate that you've got small holes where the sunlight comes in. But what is going to be of interest for us, and for those of you who are going to Paris, basically, is that the last works of the great Romantic artist who we'll be looking at next week, Eugène Delacroix, is actually in this particular church. And they're done in frescoes. This is Jacob struggles with the angel. I'll just sort of show it to you here. I'm not sure where the jet's got to there. He was originally asked to paint the Chapel of the Holy Angels, and it was a very difficult task because the walls were wet. His apprentices would put the basic fresco plaster down. He'd come in, it'd be too wet. And Delacroix at the time already was dying. He already had some form of tuberculosis, which meant that his life was very difficult, trying to paint, having to paint the ceilings and paint here. So in many ways he's chosen works which actually express his struggle with art and his struggle to be accepted with the establishment. He's thought probably to be the illegitimate son of Talleyrand. You know Talleyrand, the great sort of turncoat of the person who betrays Napoleon, amongst many others. And his work was accepted early on, possibly because of this. But he gets the Legion of Honour rather late. His friends constantly have to write representing him, so he sees his life as this solitary struggle. And so this wonderful painting here is Jacob having told his wife, or several wives and concubines and children, to go across the ford. They're going off to Canaan. He's going back to see his twin brother, who of course he's tricked. And during the night, he fights with a man, and this is actually established in the Talmud, in the Quran, in the Bible. They all have this same story, where he struggles up until dawn, and finally the angel realizes he can't defeat him and touches him and cripples him here, and then says, your name from now on will be Israel, right? And so this is why this is sort of sacred to the the Jews, and also I think it's also one of the reasons they can't eat at Tendon is because of the having touched the angel having touched him there. Anyway, it's a magnificent painting, and Delacroix will move from the 9th arrondissement, we will meet him next week, to come and live in Istanbul, Place Istanbul, which I showed you before. And he's got this wonderful little atelier which you can visit just off there. But he had to be close because he really couldn't travel very far. Now I just wanted to quickly show you what these boulevards, okay, you've got the boulevard that's been put through. It was studded with statues to great men, and they are always great men, right? Just as there's very few women's names in the metro. There's about 3, one of them is the Virgin Mary, I think. And someone's wife, Pierre et Marie Curie. I think there's only one woman, Louise Michel. So you have these statues of the great men of history, and this is what you do in Paris. You walk around and you see every street sign has, you know, for example, Claude Chappe, and it'll have his dates and it'll have what he did underneath. So you've got this idea of pride in your history, the importance of this particular area in the history of Paris and the history of France and so on. And Chappe, of course, is the first person to actually develop the semaphore, which he and his brother develop it, and it will be used extensively by Napoleon in his campaigns. And one of the reasons Napoleon does very well is that he hears about the fall of different parts, you know, within a day, or less than a day, or it would have taken days for a horse to gallop, all right? And this was this idea of tilting different pieces of wood. I won't go into it, but there is one which remains at Narbonne. There's also another fellow here who was a doctor, the first person to actually locate language at the back of the brain and so on. That's why he actually is holding a skull. And he then enters this long controversy with the phrenologists who were thinking that, you know, that your brain had different areas. Now, all of these statues were melted down by the Germans, and so they've disappeared. So this is what it would have looked like. However, there's one which remains, and that is Diderot. In fact, that is being reconstituted. Now, I want to really get on to the main part of the lecture, which is basically what we're going to do now is we've looked at Saint-Germain-des-Prés, we've looked at this area here, which isn't really Saint-Germain-des-Prés, it's only supposed to be here. We're now going to go up the Rue Bonaparte, right, which goes cut by Napoleon Bonaparte, up to the Ecole des Beaux Arts. There's the Rue Jacob, and the Rue des Beaux Arts is up here, and Visconti is there. Now, at the time, let's go back to the time of the French Revolution and the time of the mobs, which I was talking about, the time when they are unleashing their fury against the aristocracy and take to the point of actually, you know, decapitating corpses. There's an intellectual arm, of course, of the revolutionaries who are horrified by the carnage, not just of lives, but in particular of the buildings. And so at the same time as you get an edict being sent out to destroy all things that speak of privilege and religion, you also have a parallel edict being sent out that objects which speak of the past of the fatherland should be preserved. All right, so totally contradictory. So what you have is a man, Alexandre Lenoir, who is going to constitute the first collection, which will actually constitute the collection of the Louvre. And he goes out and takes not just small pieces, but even with a team takes, you know, parts of facades, tombs, miscellaneous things, and controversially also brings them back to a monastery which is in the Rue Bonaparte, the monastery of the small Augustins, well, not small, Petits Augustins, all right, the Augustin monastery. So that monastery is preserved because it is being used as a depot for objects that the mob are actually destroying while they're destroying the monasteries. It's really quite perverse. And this is now turned into the Ecole des Beaux Arts. So if you go in there, you actually, it's still in the form of it. You've been there about 4 or 5 times with me, I think, haven't you, Bar? It's still in the form of a cloister. And he will bring all of these objects, and actually you can see here, for example, this part of a church which has been brought in, and then you've got part of another building. If you look over here, you've got columns which have been relocated. And the idea was that once you took these objects out of the context of privilege and placed them in the context of people being able to see them and experience themselves as a citizen, they became worthy objects. Do you understand? It's the re-designation of exactly the same object which counts. And so what will eventually happen with this Musée des Monuments Français, it will eventually have, everything will go into the Louvre, and the Louvre will open as the first public museum, or the first large public museum. And the citizens could go in and see these objects as part of their heritage, right? And no longer belonging or signs of privilege. And so they experience themselves as citizens by being able to go into a palace and look at them, right? Because how do you experience yourself as a citizen? Now, not many of them actually could vote. You had to have a certain amount of money to do this. But this is a way of going into a space and seeing yourself. All right, so he sets them up as the Musée des Monuments Français, and this has a great influence on people like the Romantic writers, particularly people like Victor Hugo, who will be very influenced. He lives just nearby. Now, this is the first sort of museum where things are lined up chronologically, right? Up until then, museums had really been private collections with pieces placed together, often an old one with a newer one to provoke conversation, to generate ideas and reflect on the owner. Whereas this one is something which is set up deliberately to speak of the past of France and to give France this chronology that people could appreciate. So here you have the Elysian Fields here. Now, if it was broken, well, he just sort of, added a bit of plaster of Paris, which of course is what they did, during the 17th, 18th century anyhow. And it is here, he's the person who actually gets the tomb of Héloïse and Abelard, and when the museum is closed down, it is of course taken out to Père Lachaise, and it popularises Père Lachaise. No one wanted to be buried there, but once you get these two so-called lovers, you can. Now, the Ecole des Beaux Arts, of course, then takes on this role of being, once it's closed as that museum, it's used as a school, and it's taken on as the role of arbiters of art taste, right? And people who actually exhibit at the Salon have to have gone through the Ecole des Beaux Arts, difficult exam to get through, and if you had to go through there, and you had to exhibit at the Salon, because how else would you get commissions, right? There weren't little private galleries. You had to be seen there. So I just wanted to show you this. They become, of course, the bastion of conservatism, and this, of course, is the painting which wins the first prize at the Salon in 1863, at the same time that Manet exhibits his Luncheon on the Grass. So this is the difference. Now, what I want to show you is that you get in the Rue Visconti, which is just opposite, you get a whole group of people who will become the Impressionist artists coming and working together. And so this propinquity means that they meet each other and they will exchange ideas, and it is not irrelevant, of course, that they were living next to each other. Now, what you have here is Basile, who is, of course, one of the Impressionists who will die during the Franco-Prussian War. He comes from a wealthy family. He's got enough money, and poor old Renoir, of course, never has a cent. And so they live in the same little flat paid for by Basile, and don't have enough money for models, so they paint each other. And so you end up with these and marvellous portraits. Now, the person who lives next door to them, in fact, it's through the École des Beaux Arts that they're going to come together, become pupils of one of the teachers, who happens to be the teacher of Monet. All right, and we happen also to be living in the same street. They live off the same street, the Rue Bonaparte, where Manet lives. All right, so Manet, of course, comes from a very different layer of society from Renoir and Monet, who was quite poor. He is father was a judge, his mother was the goddaughter of the King of Sweden, and so on. So he had this dapper sort of flaneur who his parents had tried to put through law, as one does, and he was a total sort of failure, but however he, of course, as you know, shines in other ways. Now he lives just up the street, but another painter lives next door to Manet and Renoir, and his name is Fontaine-Latour, who's not an impressionist, who excels in these group portraits, and it's he who's going to do this wonderful portrait of the Batignolles group, in other words the 9th arrondissement, with Manet seen as a leader, even though he never exhibits as an impressionist. There's Basile, here's Monet, here's Renoir, and of course we have Zola here looking out at us. The others are critics. Now, as I said, Manet lives just up the street. Here is his father and mother, and he lives in this rather expensive building that you can, if you're lucky, get into. It is becoming increasingly difficult to get into anything in Paris because of the terrorist attacks. You can't get into places in the opera, you can no longer get into the Bank of France at night. All of these things are very difficult. You can hardly even get into the Musée d'Orsay. They've really tightened everything. All right, so if you actually look at the works of Renoir, you will see that he hasn't gone very far to do these paintings. He paints what he sees, so he just continues past Manet's house in the Rue Bonaparte and comes out on the river, and there he paints the Quai Malaquais, looking in one direction, and this is it. Now, the other one that he paints is, of course, the Pont des Arts, built, by the way, by Napoleon, the first metal bridge, and this is what it looks like today. This is the one, unfortunately, which is falling down under these padlocks that people are putting on them. Actually, when I was there last time, was it last time? I was with a group, the part of the bridge actually collapsed. I just want to sort of say that then, of course, you get Oscar Wilde living in Saint-Germain as well. He, by now, is extremely ill and very poor. This is after he's come out of Reading jail. He, of course, is fluent in French, and of course he writes plays in French. Salomé is written in French, but he will of course die quite possibly of, I think it's called encephalitis or meningitis, but it's probably tertiary syphilis, in the street just opposite in the Rue des Ecole, Rue des Beaux Arts, and it's now in a place called L'Hôtel. And this is where he has that wonderful quip talking about his wallpaper. It's so awful, one of us has to go. All right, and it was the wallpaper that stayed. All right, now we're going to now go down, we've gone through there, we're going to now go down to the Palais de Luxembourg, or the Jardin Luxembourg, which of course were set up by Catherine de Medici, yes, when her husband is killed. She can't live over there, and so she sets up her own palace at the Tuileries. Now, I want to now jump, all right, so what we've done, you see, is across the ages how this very small area generates such intense sort of groupings of people and ideas, right from the revolution to the output of the revolution, the invention of the museum through the Impressionists, and now we're actually coming up to just before the First World War with Gertrude Stein and what she calls the lost generation. This is the generation of young Americans who come and live in Paris. Now, there is also a very large, what you'd call gay community, particularly a lesbian community, that lives all around the area I've just been looking at, particularly around the Ecole des Beaux Arts. Gertrude Stein arrives in 1905 with her brother Leo, and they set up, not in the Rue de Fleurus, but a little bit further. She then meets Alice B. Toklas. I don't know whether you have read her biography of Alice B. Toklas, where Gertrude Stein speaks about herself through the mouthpiece of Alice and talks, isn't that woman Gertrude marvellous? It's quite hilarious sort of writing. Now, I shouldn't say these things, she was considered a sort of icon of modernist prose. She was trying to write the way Cézanne painted and the way Picasso painted. She was trying to be a cubist writer, which meant sort of not identifying words with objects, so it's often not easy to follow what is being said. But she has a great influence on people like Hemingway. All right, so she comes, and Leo and she are both great art collectors, and it is they who will discover and in fact promote Picasso, of course, who's living in penury up in Montmartre, and comes down to the Rue de Fleurus for these sort of salon-type evenings that she used to hold in the back, in a little kind of Renaissance building at the back, and she will introduce these members of the artistic community to each other and to the Americans. So Picasso really gets his start with her, and he does that portrait, takes him forever, and in the end he just scrubs out the face and does it from memory. And this is from Alice, the autobiography of Alice B. Tucker. It's supposed to be Alice talking. I murmured to Picasso that I liked his portrait of Gertrude Stein. Yes, he said, everyone said that she doesn't look like that, but that doesn't make any difference. She will, he said. Isn't it wonderful self-confidence to have? She also, they were really sort of trailblazers in the sense that they went to the Salon d'Automne. This is that exhibition which launches the movement of the fall. You know, the wild beasts. People saw sort of classic paintings. In the middle they had these paintings of greens and blues, and it was said, you know, these people were in the midst of wild beasts, the fall. But they buy Matisse's Woman with a Hat, and Leo in particular champions Matisse. Now there is another brother, Michael, and his wife Sarah, who come across and also buy much of Matisse's work. And Matisse, being a middle-aged man at the time, very much in rivalry with Picasso. No one ever wanted Picasso to see their work because they knew he'd steal their ideas. It is the Steins who actually give him his break. Now, this group then also includes these writers whom you know, Ernest Hemingway here with the first of his 4 wives. I do urge you to read Paris is a Veritable Feast, in which he pays homage to his first wife. However, it was heavily edited by the 4th wife, so one wonders what actually went on and whether he even remembered anything by the time he was actually writing it. He wrote it 30 years later, remembering with great nostalgia his years in Paris. All right, now he really liked to make out he was starving. All right, in actual fact he was living off his wife's sort of annuity that she got, and they could have lived quite comfortably on that. But you know, in the Paris is a Movable Feast, he's walking around, he has to walk down through the Jardin de Luxembourg, avoiding all the patisserie because his stomach's rumbling, so he goes and looks. It's really a very convincing story. Anyway, he of course will be one of the great sort of writers of this time, along with Scott Fitzgerald and Ezra Pound and all of these people, which I haven't really time to talk about, but they're more around Montparnasse. Now here he is, and he liberates Paris when he comes back in the Second World War, liberates the Bar of the Ritz, actually, is more like it. But here he is actually I think it's in the Deux Magots or in the Café de Flore with Janet Flanner. Now Janet Flanner, she is one of the group of these lesbian groups who were extremely important in the spread of ideas at this time. Now, Janet Flanner was the correspondent for the New York Times, and I think she wrote for something like 30 years, and in fact actually wrote the bulletins back to the New York Times during the occupation of Paris. So she was a very important person at that time, and that photo of her with Hemingway was actually a broadcast that they were giving at the time of the liberation of Paris, so she was there literally on the spot. But meanwhile, Hemingway had profited very much from 2 other women who were in a relationship. One of them was Sylvia Beach, and her partner, who was Adrienne Monnier, who also had a bookshop. She had an English language bookshop, and Hemingway used to go and borrow the books from here, often didn't give them back. But also Sylvia Beach has a great role in actually, she publishes the Shakespeare and Company, her shop, publishes Ulysses, and when it had been rejected by other publishers, and didn't ever get a cent back from Joyce, but she was someone who was extremely important in this role. Now, that shop actually closed, but it's opened up now near Notre Dame, and it opened up in the 50s, and they've tried to sort of do the same sort of thing. The man who opened it even christened his daughter Sylvia, and this is what it looks like inside. They still have people who can sleep there, people who actually haven't got any money, and so long as you're a writer, you can sleep there, you can borrow books, and they still have readings and so on. So it's still a sort of hub of literature. Now, where am I going now? Oh, that's right. Back to some of these lesbian groups. Now, Natalie Clifford Barney was another American who came across. They sort of all found that the climate of tolerance for these sorts of things was much greater, of course, in Paris. That's why Oscar Wilde was there. There was no law against homosexuality. I mean, it wasn't, as long as you weren't flagrant about it, it was fine. And these two ladies lived together. Now, Natalie Clifford Barney used to have a salon. She tried to set up an academy of women as opposed to the Académie Française, which was all men. And she used to have these amazing sort of soirees and evenings where people danced naked, basically, in the garden of the Rue Jacob. It still exists, and I've never been able to, I can see it over a fence, but you're not allowed to get in. So here she is in the Temple of Friendship, where all these people used to sort of disport themselves. But in the end, all of the sort of American group and were introduced to Gide, for example, and writers of the time, through these American expatriates. Now I want to get to the Deux Magots, which of course is where you get the last group, I'll have to go very quickly, of this intellectual ferment that we have. And this is now, Saint-Germain really in many ways is still like a little city, not a city but a little village unto itself, really until after the Second World War. But during that war, it is where Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir come to write. They never lived together, they always lived in separate rooms in the hotel. It's only very late that they each bought separate apartments. I mean, one of the reasons was that they had relationships with other people, and often with their best friends and with the same sex and so on. So it was much better that they didn't live together. So that during the war it was very cold, so they used to go and write, have their own table in the Deux Magots, sometimes in the Café de Flore. And this was where being and nothingness, the great sort of treatise of existentialism is hammered out, and where Simone de Beauvoir writes the Mandarin, for which she will get the Prix Goncourt. Now, it became then a hub of resistance. Well, most of the resistance, like André Malraux and other people, were actually out fighting, but Sartre was doing it in a cafe, but one does what one can. He brought around him people like Camus, who actually was a resistant and actually did fly against. Merleau-Ponty, all of the great people who had graduated out of the philosophy of agrégation of that year, and they set up the review, the Temps Moderne, which still exists. And around them you find gathering also a group of poets. I don't know if you know of Jacques Prévert, and then later on the Surrealist group as well. All right, so these 2 or 3 cafes along there really were an absolute hive of connection of ideas, very much the way the fair of Saint-Germain had been back in the Middle Ages. And no other part of Paris, I think, can claim to have had so much intellectual activity happening in such a small sort of geographical radius. Now, this is the Deux Magots. It was called the Deux Magots, by the way, because it had nothing to do with maggots. It was the Magots, of course, are Chinese figurines, and it originally was a haberdashery shop that had these at the door, and it was only taken over. Well, it was taken over at the early 20th century as a cafe. But when you go upstairs, downstairs are basically all tourists having a cup of coffee. and it's not very nice coffee. But if you go upstairs, this is actually where they used to write. And you can see it's not crowded. Very few people seem to go upstairs. And there's somebody beavering away at a probably unpublished manuscript. Now, during the war, of course, you have Miles Davis, the American GIs, particularly the black GIs, are amazed at the tolerance that the French have for people. I'm not sure what the politically correct term is now. Black. The French people who are from Africa call themselves black. And they actually sort of say to each other, I said, where's Jean-Luc? Oh, you mean Le Black? You mean the black? It's really quite interesting. So they've actually appropriated, that as a way of speaking about themselves. But of course, you're beginning to get at this time in the all is around this little part here. The Caveau de la Huchette, for example, jazz and rock and roll sort of coming, and Simone de Beauvoir, not Sartre, was a great sort of dancer as well. So when she'd finished writing her manuscript, she'd go and dance. All right, I'm not sure it wasn't the group I had in Paris with you, Marine, but I invited my eldest son along with the students for 2 days, and it was a total disaster because I would take them out. I had a film which was an educational film, and out of 20 of them, two of them would appear, and they'd all go off with Jeremy to these nightclubs. And the next morning, I knew there were funny looks on their faces, and one girl who had beautiful hair, black hair, came back with her hair cut up to here, and thought, oh, well, And turns out at the reunion a year later, it turned out that her hair had caught fire down in the and they had to amputate it virtually to get it out. I had no idea. I was sort of, waxing eloquent about Zola and, anyway. So I do know this area quite well. But this also is this area of this archetypical idea of what, the French are like, isn't it? Sort of this cigarette sort of, out the Gauloise, hanging out of the mouth, the long black hair, and that sort of je ne sais quoi sort of attitude. Whereas as you were coming in, I had her singing Saint-Germain des Prés with the sort of angst that the French managed to, existential angst that they managed to put into the simplest song, and that when you actually translate it into English, it doesn't come over quite the same. So round these cafes, you now get, after the sort of, Sartre and Beauvoir have moved on, you're now going to get all of the new wave of cinema, Jean-Luc Godard, Truffaut, then you get Gainsbourg, Berkin, of course their daughter now is Charlotte Gainsbourg, Django Reinhardt, and so on. So right up, I suppose, until the 70s, Saint-Germain-des-Prés really was still identified with new ideas. What has happened now is that it has, first of all, been bought, the real estate has been bought by foreigners. The English also have huge stakes in this area, but also Anglo-Saxons in general tend to throng to this area. And gradually, the tourist dollar has had the effect that the rent of all of the buildings around has become so high that the little shops and the little galleries, which actually make its charm, and even the bookshops, which were iconic bookshops, La Une, which was where all of these writers used to hang out, meet each other, read it aloud. All of these are now being turned over to luxury stores. So this same building, which is La Une, first of all, it used to be just in between the Café des Deux Magots and the Café de Flore. Couldn't actually keep up the rent on the Boulevard Saint-Germain, so it moved into one of the little streets on the Rue de l'Abbey, and I think it's in about 5 or 6 years ago, it collapsed. It could not sell its books. I mean, because the majority of people who were thronging around there were not French speakers, they didn't live there, and so they weren't, of course, buying heavy tomes of philosophy. And so it actually folded. And so now you have the flagship of Louis Vuitton. You often have a queue of Japanese people, and that's why, literally, that's why you've actually got those ropes there to keep the queue. And you now have security guards as well. But you've still got the beggars outside, the ones there used to be one beggar who was always there at La Une. So Saint-Germain-des-Prés is really in a state of flux, I suppose, at the moment. What do these areas, which have been so fascinating and then attract people to come there, what do they do? How do they maintain their original character? And the same thing has basically happened in Rome at Café de Flore. When I went there 10 years ago, you'd go and you'd buy your sausages and cheese, then gradually they disappeared, and then there's a few flower markets, and now they're actually selling objects that they think people would think one should sell there. Do you know what I mean? It's a kind of a second thinking of what the tourists like. So you've got coloured pasta and stuff. So it has really changed, and to some degree Saint-Germain-des-Prés is doing that. I mean, with this, because for the Japanese, that is taking away a piece of Paris, is taking away your Louis Vuitton bag. I mean, I've been guilty of it, but I mean, it's a very interesting phenomenon. Anyway, that really is the way I should probably not be ending on a down note and destroying your illusions of this absolutely enchanting little area, which it spreads really from the 6th arrondissement around to the 7th and right down to Saint-Sulpice. So that is it for today.